At first glance, the poodle's coat looks like a style choice. Then the skin tells a different story. Each tight curl carries the feel of something inherited, something written long before a groomer ever touched it. That is where the trail begins, not in a salon, but in the DNA that shapes the follicle itself. If you're the kind of person who needs to know the story behind the surface, this channel is built for exactly that. Subscribe now, because the deeper the DNA goes, the stranger the picture gets. The key name in this story is KRT71. In a 2009 study titled Coat Variation in the Domestic Dog is Governed by Variants in 3 Genes, published in the journal Science and later archived on PubMed Central, geneticists Edouard Cadieux and Elaine Ostrander of the National Human Genome Research Institute at the NIH linked this gene to curly coats in dogs. The finding matters because it does not describe the coat as a vague preference of appearance. It places the texture inside biology. Variants in KRT71 explain a large part of the phenotype seen in dogs with short, wavy, or curly hair, and that includes the visual identity people recognize immediately in the poodle. The detail that makes the case even sharper is the specific mutation. The study described a missense change, ARG151TRP, located in exon 2. Those few letters and numbers sound small, almost fragile, but they alter how the coat develops. A substitution at that point in the sequence is enough to move the hair away from a straight pattern and into the signature curl that turns the poodle into a walking example of inherited form. It is not decoration added later. It is structure from the start. That distinction changes everything. When a poodle moves through a room, the coat does more than catch the light. It carries evidence of selection, breeding, and the long fixation of a trait that breeders valued until it became stable enough to define the breed. The curl is not random. It is the visible surface of a genetic choice repeated over generations. And because the trait is so obvious, the poodle becomes one of the clearest places to see how a mutation can stop being an accident and become identity. There is something unsettling in that clarity. A dog can look ornate, refined, almost sculpted, yet the secret behind the look may come down to one change in one exon. KRT71 turns beauty into a biological event. It shows that what people call a type is often a history of inheritance made visible in fur, not a surface effect. The poodle's coat does not simply suggest a lineage, it records one. That is why this gene matters beyond the breed itself. The same framework helps explain why dogs differ so sharply in coat texture from one another, and why certain traits persist once they are selected and fixed. The poodle is not just an elegant example. It is a readable archive. In its curls, the body reveals a message about variation, domestication, and the quiet power of a mutation to shape how a living animal is seen. If this kind of genetic trail catches your attention, stay close, because the next layer is not about how the curl appears, but why some lines held onto it with such precision while others never did. That difference changes the whole meaning of the breed. That question about precision and inheritance is exactly the kind of pattern the full archive was built to track. Beyond KRT71, there are dozens of other markers, for coat, for size, for the traits breeders spent centuries shaping, all mapped out in the complete dog DNA archive, with the link waiting in the description and the first comment. Keep this thread going, because the next layer changes what a single curl can prove. The first surprise is that a curl cannot stand alone. In that same Cadieux and Ostrander study, every curly-coated dog they examined was homozygous for the FGF5 mutation linked to long hair, which means the hair had to reach enough length before the spiral could even appear. That detail changes the whole picture. The curl is not simply written into a single switch and left there. It needs a supporting condition, a longer fiber, a context in which shape can finally emerge. So the story shifts from a single mutation to a sequence of requirements. First comes length, then texture, then the visible pattern that people recognize at a glance. In the same article, the researchers described the combination of RSPO2, FGF5, and KRT71 as responsible for a large share of coat phenotypes in purebred dogs in the United States. That is a much more crowded genetic stage than the early assumption suggests. One locus prepares the ground, another changes growth, and another helps define the bend that gives the surface its unmistakable movement. By 2014, a review titled Insights into Morphology and Disease from the Dog Genome Project, written by Jeffrey Schoenebeck and Elaine Ostrander at the National Human Genome Research Institute, sharpened that view even more, stating that variants in RSPO2, FGF5 and KRT71 explain about 80% of the variation seen in length, growth, and curl across dog coats. 80% is not a minor clue. It is a map. It tells us that the visible diversity across dogs is not scattered chaos, but a pattern with repeated coordinates. And in that map, the poodle appears again, explicitly named as a case in which curly hair can be explained by KRT71, even while the larger picture refuses to stay simple. That refusal matters. If the poodle were only KRT71, the story would be neat, almost too neat, but the data keeps widening the frame. The 2009 analysis shows that long hair is already part of the condition for the curl to form, and the same 3-gene combination helps account for a large part of what purebred coats become. In other words, the phenotype is built the way a room is made livable. One element opens the space, another gives it structure, and another changes the way light and motion are perceived inside it. Seen this way, the poodle is not a symbol of one isolated mutation triumphing over everything else. It is a visible agreement between several genetic signals that happen to converge in the same body. That is why the next question is harder than the first. Once a trait depends on more than one gene, what exactly was ever being selected? The curl alone, the length alone, or the whole arrangement that lets a coat become unmistakably poodle-shaped? By 2019, the poodle no longer looked like an isolated genetic curiosity. A new line of evidence appeared in PubMed, and it sharpened the picture instead of smoothing it out. Geneticists Elina Salmela and Hannes Lohi at the University of Helsinki identified a second causal curly coat variant in KRT71, this time a structural change in exon 7, CU on 1266, 73 Delinsay CA. The predicted impact on the protein was severe enough that the researchers treated it as more than a small variation. It was a break in the script of the follicle, another way for the same visible trait to emerge. That is where the story turns. Up to this point, the curl had been framed as if one path in the DNA could explain a recognizable coat, but the 2019 study refuses that simplicity. It shows that more than one mutation can lead to curl, and that the poodle is only part of a wider genetic landscape. The same variant was seen in other curly breeds as well: Lagotto Romagnolo, Bichon Frise, Spanish Water Dog, Chesapeake Bay Retriever, and Irish Terrier. The evidence did not shrink the mystery. It expanded it. Suddenly, the question is no longer whether a dog carries a curly coat change. It is which change, in which line, and with what effect on the body that grows the hair. Two dogs may arrive at the same silhouette through different molecular routes. One may carry one alteration in KRT71, another a different structural hit in the same gene, and the coat still folds into those tight familiar waves that humans learned to notice, select, and preserve. That is a more unsettling answer, because it means the phenotype can look singular while the biology underneath is plural. And that pluralism matters for the poodle. The breed remains explicitly identified in this archive because it is part of the original map of curly hair, but the map is no longer centered on a single point. The poodle now sits beside other breeds as evidence that selection did not freeze one mutation into one aesthetic outcome. It preserved a result, not a mechanism. In practical terms, that means a breeder looking at a curly coat is seeing the end of a long genetic route, not necessarily the same route every time. Read that way, the coat becomes less like a badge and more like a record of converging accidents that breeding kept from disappearing. A twist in one exon, a second variant in the same gene, and then a set of breeds separated by history, yet reunited by texture. The archive is starting to say something larger. Curl is not a single event, but a recurring solution. If you want the next layer of this canine record, stay with it, because the important part is not only that the trait appears again, but that nature keeps reaching the same surface through different instructions. For anyone who wants to keep tracing that kind of convergence, the full archive breaks down the recurring mutations across dozens of breeds, cross-references coat genes with temperament and health markers, and walks through how breeders selected for the same result through entirely different genetic routes, all reachable through the link in the description and the first comment. On paper, the answer seemed simple. The poodle had already been tied to the genetics of its signature texture. But the next layer of the archive does something more unsettling. It shows that the coat does not switch on in a single clean way. In the 2019 study describing that second KRT71 variant, Anna Bauer and Tosso Lieb's team at the University of Bern described the mutation as semi-dominant. In a heterozygous animal, it can produce a wavy coat. In the right genetic context, it can support the tighter curl associated with the poodle. That detail matters because it turns an apparently finished trait into a spectrum. The animal is not merely curly or not curly. Its body is reading dosage, combination, and context at once. And then the archive widens. In a 2020 genomic analysis of the modern Australian Labradoodle, led by Elaine Ostrander's team at the National Human Genome Research Institute, RSPO2, FGF5, and KRT71, again appear together as the trio that explains most structural coat phenotypes in dogs. 3 genes, not a forest of hidden instructions, but a compact architecture with enough leverage to create surprisingly different surfaces. That is where the poodle becomes especially revealing. Its phenotype is not just a single feature hanging from the animal-like decoration. It is the result of a genetic arrangement in which one signal shapes texture, another allows sufficient length, and the full appearance emerges only when those pieces meet in the same body. The comparison with other breeds sharpens the image. In that same study, researchers tested 2 KRT71 variants and found that 24 of 30 poodles carried the derived allele linked to curl, while every Labrador examined carried the ancestral allele associated with a non-curly coat. The numbers do not feel abstract when you read them closely. They show a breed in which the poodle side of the equation still carries the texture-making version at high frequency, while the Labrador side preserves the older state. In other words, the archive is not just naming a mutation. It is measuring how often an animal inherits the version that bends the hair fiber into a curl. A second comparison deepens the contrast. The same study reported that poodles and Labradors also diverged at FGF5. 19 of 21 Labradoodles and all 7 poodles were homozygous for the long hair allele, while 23 of 24 Labradors were homozygous for the short hair allele. That means the poodle's look cannot be reduced to texture alone. The animal brings together enough length for the curl to be expressed, and enough structural guidance for the coat to hold its form. A poodle with short hair would not read the same way. A long coat without the curl program would not read the same way either. The phenotype is an agreement between genes, not a single signature. What makes this turn unexpectedly rich is the human side of the biology. Breeders did not preserve a symbol in the abstract. They preserved a body that repeatedly produced the same visual experience across generations. Someone looking at a poodle is not seeing only elegance or breed identity. They are seeing a stable outcome built from inherited probabilities, from alleles that continue to travel together often enough to make the pattern feel familiar. If you have ever watched a poodle move through water or across a grooming table, you already know the effect. The coat does not behave like ordinary fur. It frames the animal, catches light differently, and changes how every motion is read. So the deeper revelation is not that the poodle has a curly phenotype, it is that the phenotype is assembled from layers that can separate, recombine, and still arrive at a recognizable result. KRT71 helps set the texture, FGF5 helps make room for it, and the broader breed history keeps both traits anchored in a body people can see, touch, and remember. That is why the archive feels larger now than when it began. The poodle no longer appears as a simple case of one visible trait. It stands as evidence that a familiar look can emerge from a narrow genetic corridor, and yet still carry enough complexity to keep surprising us. If you want to stay with this record, stay close to the coat itself, because the next question is not why it curls, but why this form became so enduring in the first place. If this kind of layered evidence is worth following, that's what a subscribe and a like tell the channel to keep building. And if there's a breed whose coat or history you want traced next, drop it in the comments. Some of the best archive entries start there. By the time the record reaches its end, the poodle no longer feels like a decorative silhouette. It feels like evidence that arrived in motion, soaked through with history. The American Kennel Club describes the breed as having a curled or corded coat and links its early function to retrieving waterfowl in cold water. That detail matters, because it pulls the story away from vanity and back into use. The look was never just a look. It was carried by a body expected to work in wet conditions, where insulation, movement, and coat behavior could matter as much as appearance. And once that shift is seen, the rest of the comparison opens in a different way. The same AKC historical material also notes that the poodle's distinctive coat helped influence other breeds, including the curly-coated retriever, the Irish water spaniel, and the Portuguese water dog. That is not a side note. It means the poodle was not merely one branch on a family tree of texture. It became a reference point, a visible template whose form traveled outward into other lines of breeding history. The pattern of curls, in other words, did not stay isolated. It spread as a preference, a function, and eventually a legacy. This is where the comparison with the Bichon frieze sharpens the picture. A 2010 essay on canine morphology, published in PLOS Biology as Canine Morphology, Hunting for Genes and Tracking Mutations, by Abigail Sheerin and Elaine Ostrander of the National Human Genome Research Institute, reports that the Bichon frieze carries variant alleles at RSPO2, FGF5, and KRT71, producing a coat that is long, curly, and furnished. That combination is important because it shows how a recognizable appearance can emerge from more than one genetic layer at once. Curl, length, and furnishings are not the same thing, and the Bichon makes that separation visible. The coat is assembled, not improvised. Seen beside the poodle, the comparison becomes even more revealing. The poodle's historical identity as a water-working breed and its genetic role in the wider family of curly-coated dogs fit together in a way that makes the breed feel almost like a pivot point. It preserved a form that was useful in one environment, then echoed far beyond it in selective breeding. That is why the poodle matters so much in the broader archive of dog DNA, not because it is unusual to look at, but because it helped define what unusual could become when breeders kept choosing the same visible outcome, generation after generation. There is also a harder truth inside that history. The elegant image of a poodle, or any similarly curled breed, can hide the mechanism that made the image possible in the first place. What looks like style is often the surface expression of specific structural and regulatory variants in the follicle itself. The Sheerin and Ostrander review, together with later genetic work, makes that point unavoidable. The coat is not a costume placed over the animal. It is the result of inherited instructions acting inside growth tissue, shaping what can emerge and what cannot. That changes how the poodle should be remembered, not as a breed with a memorable outline, but as a living record of selection, function, and inheritance crossing paths in one body. Its coat tells the story of labor in cold water, of breeders preserving a striking form, and of other breeds borrowing from the same visual language. It also tells a quieter story, that a familiar trait can survive because people kept seeing meaning in it long before they understood the DNA beneath it. That's the record, and it's the kind of thread this channel exists to pull. Subscribe, share it with someone who'd see their own dog differently after this, and stay close for the next archive entry. So when the poodle appears now, it carries more than curl. It carries a history of purpose, a pattern shared across breeds, and a genetic logic that makes beauty look less accidental than it once seemed. The final impression is not simply that the breed is iconic. It is that the icon itself is built from biological memory, and once that is understood, the coat is never just coat again.